On the morning of March 26, 1945, a Japanese officer stood on a ridge overlooking the sea west of Okinawa and raised his binoculars. What he saw made him lower them, then raise them again. Ships. Hundreds of them. More ships than he had ever seen in one place. They filled the water from horizon to horizon, a forest of gray steel that seemed to go on forever. Battleships, carriers, cruisers, destroyers, transports, supply vessels, all moving together in formation, their wakes cutting white lines through the dark Pacific water. He counted for a while, then stopped. There were too many. This was the American Fifth Fleet, and it was the largest naval force ever put together in human history. More than 1,300 ships, 40 aircraft carriers, 18 battleships, 200 destroyers. It was bigger than any fleet the British had ever assembled, bigger than anything the Germans had built, bigger than the entire Japanese Navy at its peak. The officer had been in the Navy for 20 years. He had fought at Pearl Harbor. He had seen the victories at the Philippines, at the Dutch East Indies, at Singapore. He had watched the Imperial fleet push across the Pacific like a wave, taking everything in front of it. That fleet was gone now. Most of it sat at the bottom of the ocean. The rest was hiding in ports back home, running low on fuel, running low on pilots, running low on time. And now this. He watched the American ships move into position. They worked with a kind of calm efficiency that told him they had done this many times before. No confusion, no panic, just ship after ship sliding into place, ready to do what they had come here to do. Someone moved up beside him, a younger officer, barely 25, looking out at the water with wide eyes. "Sir," the young man said quietly, "how many do you think there are?" The older officer didn't answer right away. He was looking at one of the destroyers, a Fletcher-class ship moving through the outer screen. He had seen that ship before, or one like it. Maybe it was at Leyte Gulf, or the Philippines. He couldn't remember anymore. The Americans had so many of them now, they all started to look the same. "More than we can stop," he finally said. The young officer nodded slowly. He was still staring at the fleet. "They say we sank dozens of their ships in the Philippines, dozens more at Iwo Jima, but they just keep coming back. It's like they have an endless supply." The older officer lowered his binoculars. He thought about the reports that had been coming in over the past year, pilots returning from missions claiming they had sunk American carriers, officers reporting direct hits on battleships, watching them burn and list and go dead in the water. Victory after victory. And yet here they were. We did sink them. We hit them hard, harder than anyone thought we could. Then how? They fixed them. The words came out flat, matter of fact. They take the damaged ships back to their bases, they patch them up, they send them back out, and they do it faster than we can sink them. The young officer looked at him. "Is that possible?" The older man didn't answer, because the truth was he didn't know if it was possible. It shouldn't be possible. No navy in history had ever been able to repair ships that quickly, on that scale, in the middle of a war. But the Americans weren't like any navy in history. He remembered something Admiral Yamamoto had said back before Pearl Harbor, before the war. Yamamoto had spent time in America. He had seen their factories, their shipyards, their industrial cities that stretched for miles. And he had said something that most of the other officers had dismissed at the time. He had said, "If we go to war with them, we will win for 6 months, maybe a year. After that, they will bury us." Everyone had laughed. No one was laughing now. The older officer raised his binoculars again and looked at the fleet. He tried to pick out individual ships, tried to see if any of them looked familiar. There was a battleship out there, one of the big ones, Maryland maybe, or Virginia. I thought he had heard it had been sunk at Pearl Harbor, but there it was, very much afloat with its guns trained towards the shore. Or maybe it was a different ship. He couldn't tell anymore. "What do we do?" the young officer asked. The older man kept watching the horizon. More ships were appearing now, coming up from the south. Landing craft, thousands of them. Small boats that would carry the Marines and soldiers to the beaches. Behind them more support ships. More ammunition, more fuel, more of everything. He thought about the plan that headquarters had sent down. They were supposed to hold Okinawa. They were supposed to make the Americans pay for every foot of ground. They were supposed to inflict so many casualties that the Americans would lose their will to fight. But looking out at that fleet, at the sheer weight of steel and firepower sitting out there in the water, he wondered if the plan had ever made sense at all. We do what we were ordered to do. We fight. The young officer nodded, but his face was pale and his hands were shaking slightly as he adjusted his own binoculars. They stood there together on the ridge, watching the American fleet settle into position. The sun was higher now and the light was catching on the water, making the whole scene look almost peaceful.
just ships at anchor, just metal floating on the sea. But both men knew what was coming. The Americans had brought their fleet, the largest fleet ever made, and somewhere behind it, somewhere across thousands of miles of ocean, were the factories and shipyards that had built it. The forges that could replace every ship they lost, the workers who could repair every ship they damaged. Japan had fought with everything it had. It had thrown its best pilots into the sky. It had sent its finest ships into battle. It had sacrificed thousands of men in suicide attacks, hoping that desperation and courage could make up for the difference in numbers. And for a while, it had worked. For a while, they had hurt the Americans. They had sunk their ships. They had killed their sailors. They had made them pay. But then the Americans had taken those damaged ships, and they had fixed them, and they had come back. That was the thing that finally broke through. Standing on that ridge, looking at that fleet, the realization that had been building for months but was only now impossible to ignore. They weren't fighting a navy. They were fighting a machine that could build faster than Japan could destroy, a machine that could repair faster than Japan could damage, a machine that just kept coming, no matter how many times you hit it. The older officer lowered his binoculars one last time. He turned to the young man beside him. "Get everyone ready," he said. "They'll be landing soon." The young officer saluted and ran back down the ridge toward the bunkers and caves where the troops were waiting. The older officer stayed for another minute watching the fleet, memorizing it, because he knew, somehow, that this was a moment he would remember for the rest of his life, however long that turned out to be. Then he turned and walked down the hill, leaving the ghost fleet behind him, waiting on the water like a promise that couldn't be broken. The older officer walked down the ridge toward a concrete bunker built into the hillside. The entrance was covered with logs and camouflage netting that smelled like wet earth and pine. Inside, a single light bulb hung from a wire, flickering as generators hummed somewhere deep underground. A young corporal sat at a wooden table, typing on a field telephone. He looked up when the officer entered. "Message for General Ushijima," the officer said. He pulled a small notebook from his pocket and started writing. His hand moved quickly across the paper, numbers and observations filling the page. He wrote about the fleet size, the ship types, the formations. He wrote about the battleship that looked like one that sunk before. He wrote about the destroyers, the carriers, the endless line of landing craft. Then he paused. He looked at what he had written. At the bottom of the page, he added one more line. It was not a number or a tactical observation. It was just a short sentence that said everything. The Americans are repairing their ships faster than we can sink them. He folded the paper and handed it to the corporal. "Make sure the general sees this immediately." The corporal nodded and picked up a black field telephone. He cranked the handle and waited. Then he started reading the message word by word into the receiver. In the main command bunker, 3 miles inland, General Mitsuru Ushijima sat at a metal table. The bunker was cooler than outside, carved deep into the limestone hills. Maps covered the walls, showing the American landing zones, the Japanese defensive positions, the artillery placements. Red pins marked where they expected the enemy to come ashore. Blue pins showed where they had already landed. A telephone rang. Major General Isamu Cho picked it up. He listened, his face unreadable. He hung up and walked to Ushijima's table. He placed the handwritten message in front of him. Ushijima read it once. Then he read it again. He had seen many reports in his 40 years of service. Reports of victories, reports of defeats, reports of men dying in places he could barely pronounce. But this one was different. He looked at Cho. How reliable is this? The officer on the ridge has been with the fleet for 2 decades. He was at Pearl Harbor. He knows ships. Ushijima stood up and walked to a map of the Pacific. He had pins on that map too. Red pins for Japanese victories, blue pins for American ships reported sunk. The map was covered in blue pins, dozens of them. Carriers at Midway, battleships at Pearl Harbor, cruisers in the Philippines, destroyers all across the ocean. According to this map, the American Navy should have been half its current size, maybe less. But the report on his desk told him something else. It told him that many of those blue pins should have been removed. Not because the reports were wrong. They had hit those ships. They had sunk them. But because the Americans had done the impossible, they had brought them back. Ushijima thought about his own navy. The Imperial Japanese Navy had started this war with the finest ships in the world. Better torpedoes, better night fighting tactics, better pilots. They'd won battles that shocked the world. But when a Japanese ship was hit, it stayed hit. There were no massive repair yards waiting in Tokyo Bay. No endless supply of steel and welders and engineers who could put a carrier back together in 6 months. When a Japanese carrier went down, it was gone forever. When a battleship sank, it was a monument on the ocean floor. The Americans were different. They had places like Pearl Harbor. They had San Diego. They had Bremerton. They had something the report didn't name but that Ushijima knew existed. They had an entire country behind them, a country that could build and fix and rebuild again and again. Cho spoke quietly. There are rumors from Homa staff. They say the Americans have a place on the West Coast, a shipyard where they can repair a carrier in 90 days. 90 days. Ushijima had been on a carrier once. He had walked its decks, seen its complexity, the miles of wiring, the thousands of tons of steel.
The idea of repairing something like that in 90 days seemed like magic. But magic was just technology you didn't understand. And the Americans had technology. They had resources. They had the one thing Japan had run out of: time. The general walked to the bunker entrance and looked out. From here, he couldn't see the sea. He could see only the green hills of Okinawa, the villages, the roads. But he knew what was out there. He knew what was coming. "Contact Tokyo," he said to Cho. "Tell them the fleet has arrived. Tell them it's larger than we expected. Tell them," he paused, "tell them we may need to reconsider our estimates of American naval strength." Cho nodded and picked up the phone. Ushijima went back to his table. He pulled out his own notebook, smaller than the officer's, bound in leather that was cracking at the edges. He wrote the date, March 26th, 1945. Then he wrote one word: ghosts. Because that was what they were fighting now. Not ships, ghosts. Ships that should have been dead, but weren't. Ships that came back from the bottom of the ocean, repaired and refitted, and ready to fight again. He thought about the men who crewed those ships, the American sailors. He had never met one, but he had studied their tactics. They were not superhuman. They made mistakes. They could be surprised. They could be hurt. But they could also be repaired. Their ships could be fixed. Their losses could be replaced. Their courage could be reinforced with fresh men and fresh steel, again and again, until the enemy simply ran out of everything. And Japan was running out of everything. The bunker shook slightly as an American plane passed overhead, high up, probably a reconnaissance flight taking photographs. The light bulb swayed. Dust fell from the ceiling. Cho was still on the phone, reading numbers to someone in Tokyo who didn't want to hear them. Ushijima closed his notebook. He thought about the officer on the ridge. He thought about the young man with shaking hands. He thought about all the men on this island, in these bunkers and caves, waiting for the Americans to come ashore. They had a plan. They would let the Americans land. They would draw them in. They would fight them in the hills and the caves and the tunnels. They would make it so bloody, so costly, that the Americans would stop. That was the plan. That had always been the plan. But looking at the report on his desk, at that one line about repaired ships, Ushijima wondered if the Americans knew how to stop. He wondered if they had ever stopped at anything. The phone clicked as Cho hung up. "Tokyo acknowledges. They say the combined fleet will send what support it can." Both men knew what that meant. It meant nothing. The combined fleet barely existed anymore. A few old battleships with no fuel, a handful of planes with no experienced pilots, some submarines that couldn't surface without being spotted. The real combined fleet was sitting out there, in the water. Only it wasn't Japanese, it was American. And it was undefeated because it was unkillable. Ushijima looked at the map again. He looked at all those blue pins. "Remove them," he said to Cho. "Sir?" "All the pins for ships we claim to have sunk in the last year, remove them. We need to know what we're actually facing, not what we wish we had sunk, what is actually out there." Cho walked to the map and started pulling pins. One by one, the blue markers came off. Dozens of them. The map looked different afterward, cleaner, more honest. But the ocean outside was still full of ships. Real ships. Ships that moved and fired and carried men and planes and death. Ships that came back from the bottom of the ocean, repaired and refitted and ready to fight again. March 27th began with a sound that wasn't there before. The older officer was back in the bunker when it started. A low rumble, like distant thunder, but the sky was clear. Then the ground shook. Dust fell from the ceiling. The light bulb swung on its wire. "Naval gunfire," someone said. They went to the observation slit, a narrow opening in the concrete that looked out towards the coast. The fleet was still there, but now it was awake. Flashes of light sparked from the battleships.
bright as camera flashes, and a few seconds later the sound rolled across the island like a wave. The water around the ships boiled with shell splashes as the Japanese shore batteries fired back. But their guns were small, and the American ships were far away. The officer watched a battleship through his binoculars. It was one of the big ones, Maryland class, maybe West Virginia. He had been at Pearl Harbor when the West Virginia went down. He had seen it burn, its deck awash with oil and fire, its hull torn open by torpedoes. It had settled in the mud, a wreck, a total loss. But there it was, 15 miles off the coast, firing its main guns. He could see the water spouts where its shells landed, big 16-inch shells that weighed more than a car. Each one threw up a column of sand and smoke that climbed hundreds of feet into the air. He looked at the ship's profile. He looked at the number on its bow. He couldn't make it out clearly, but it didn't matter. He knew that ship. He had watched it die. Now it was killing them. The bombardment went on all day.
They were collapsing caves. They were turning concrete bunkers into tombs. But the reports that interested him most were the ship identifications. Officers along the coast were reporting ship names, familiar names they had seen on casualty lists. A destroyer called the Franklin, hit by a bomb at Saipan, reported sunk. There it was, shelling the northern coast. A cruiser called the Minneapolis, torpedoed at Guadalcanal, its bow blown off. There it was, firing broadsides. A carrier called the Enterprise. They had hit it 3 times, 3 different battles. 3 times they had watched it burn. There it was, its planes circling overhead like gulls. The list grew longer. The bombardment lasted for 5 days. 5 days of thunder and dust and waiting. 5 days of watching ships that shouldn't exist. On the morning of April 1st, the shelling stopped. The silence was sudden and complete, like someone had turned off a radio. The Japanese troops in their caves and bunkers looked at each other. They checked their rifles. They said quiet prayers. The older officer was in a forward observation post, a hole underground covered by logs and dirt. He looked through his binoculars at the fleet. The ships were moving again, but differently now. The big warships were backing away. The smaller ships were coming forward. Landing craft, hundreds of them. Small boats with flat fronts that would drop down and let soldiers run onto the beach. They were forming up in waves, circling behind the larger ships, waiting for the signal. He could see men in the boats, tiny figures in green helmets. He could see the sunlight on their rifle barrels. He could see smoke from the engines. He lowered his binoculars and looked at his watch. 8:30 a.m. A single plane flew overhead. It dropped a flare. It was green, bright against the blue sky. Then the first wave of landing craft turned toward the beach. Their engines were a low growl that grew louder. The second wave followed, then the third. The officer picked up his field phone. He cranked it and waited. "General Ushijima?" he said when the connection was made. "They're coming." He hung up. He looked at his men, 10 soldiers in the hole with him. They were young. Most of them were from Okinawa itself, conscripted into the Japanese army. They had been told the Americans were demons, that they would be tortured and killed if captured. They had been told to fight to the death. The officer looked at their faces. They were scared. That was good. Scared men were careful men. "Wait for my order," he said. "Let them leave the boats. Let them get on the sand. Then we hit them." They nodded. They checked their machine gun. They checked their ammunition. They waited. The first landing craft hit the beach at 8:32 a.m. The front ramp dropped. American Marines ran out, their rifles up, moving fast. More boats landed. More men came out. The officer watched them through his binoculars. They were well trained. They kept low. They moved in teams. They didn't bunch up. He let them get 50 yards up the beach. Then he gave the order. Fire. The machine guns started. Rifles cracked. Mortars thumped. The Americans dropped into the sand, returning fire. More landing craft came in, and more and more. For every American that fell, 3 more took his place. The officer watched a destroyer close to shore, its guns firing in support. He recognized it. The USS Laffey. He had seen the report. It had been hit by 6 kamikazes at Okinawa just last month. 6
planes, direct hits. The report said it had burned for hours and sunk. But there it was, 500 yards off the beach, its 5-inch guns pounding the Japanese positions, protecting the men in the sand. He watched it fire. He watched the shells hit the hillside above his position, throwing dirt and rock. He watched it turn slightly, its guns adjusting, firing again. A young private crawled over to him. "Sir, the radio. Headquarters says more ships are landing to the north. They say it's the same ships we saw at Iwo Jima." The officer didn't take his eyes off the Laffey. "What ships?" "The battleship Nevada, sir. The one they said we sank at Pearl Harbor. And the Saratoga, hit by torpedoes twice. Both of them are out there, shelling the positions." The officer lowered his binoculars and looked at the private. The boy was 17, maybe 18. He'd probably never seen a ship before this war. "How many men do you think are on that destroyer?" the officer asked quietly. The private looked at the Laffey. "I don't know, sir. Maybe 300? Maybe. And if we sink it, they'll build another one and crew it with 300 more and send it back here." The private looked confused. "But sir, we can't build ships anymore. We have no steel." "I know. Then how do we win?" The officer watched the Laffey fire again. He thought about the factories in America he had never seen, the shipyards working day and night, the welders and riveters who had never fired a rifle but were winning the war anyway. "We don't," he said. The private stared at him. The officer looked away. He raised his binoculars again and watched the beach, where the Americans were still coming, wave after wave, from ships that wouldn't stay dead. The private kept staring. He opened his mouth, then closed it. Around them, the machine gun kept firing, the mortar crews kept loading, but the boy's eyes stayed locked on the officer's face. "We don't," he had said. Down the beach, a landing craft took a direct hit from a shore battery. It flipped sideways, its ramp still down, men spilling into the surf. But 3 more boats were already behind it, pushing through the smoke. The officer looked away from the private.
He lifted the field phone again and cranked it. This time he asked for artillery support. He gave coordinates. He spoke in a flat voice, like a man ordering dinner. When he hung up, he looked at the Laffey one more time. The destroyer had turned broadside now. Its hull number was clear, 724. He didn't need to see the name to know it. The Laffey had been commissioned in 1943, sunk, according to their reports, in March 1945. Here it was, April 1st, alive and firing. "Sir?" The private was still there. "What?" "If we can't win, why are we fighting?" The officer didn't have an answer that would make sense to a boy who had been taught that death in battle was the highest honor, so he said the only thing that was true. Because they're here. That afternoon, in a cave 2 miles north, 5 Japanese pilots sat on wooden crates. Their planes were hidden in camouflaged revetments outside, old Zeros patched with spare parts. They were listening to a briefing officer, a captain who had flown in the Philippines and at Iwo Jima. He had a map spread on a crate. He was using a stick to point at ship positions. But his hand kept stopping. He would point to a carrier, start to say its name, then pause. "That carrier," he said, "the one off the northeast coast. It's the Bunker Hill." One of the pilots, a lieutenant named Kikuchi, raised his hand. "Sir, the Bunker Hill was reported sunk 2 weeks ago, at Kyushu. Kamikaze attack." The captain looked at the map. He didn't look at the pilots. The report was mistaken. "Mistaken, sir? The pilot who made that attack was my friend. He radioed back. He saw the explosions. He saw the ship burning." "The ship is there," the captain said. His voice was tired. "It's launching planes right now. You can hear them." They could. The drone of American engines overhead had become constant, like cicadas in summer. Another pilot spoke up. "What about the Franklin? We hit it with 2 bombs in March. It was dead in the water. I saw the photographs." "It's there too," the captain said. 50 miles southeast, firing on our positions." The pilots looked at each other. Kikuchi thought about his friend, about the radio message, the pride in his voice as he described his final dive. He thought about the letters they had sent to the family, telling them he had sunk an American carrier. "Sir," Kikuchi said quietly, "if the ships we sink keep coming back, what is the point?" The captain folded his map. He looked at the 5 pilots. They were all young. The oldest was 23. They had grown up hearing stories of the great victories at Pearl Harbor, at Midway, at the Coral Sea. They had been told that one Japanese pilot was worth 10 Americans, that their spirit would carry them through. The point, the captain said, is that we hurt them. Even if they fix the ships, they can't bring back the dead sailors. They can't replace the experienced crews. Eventually, they will run out of men willing to die on ships that keep getting hit. He said it like he believed it, but Kikuchi saw his eyes. The captain didn't believe it any more than the beach officer had. In the main command bunker, General Cho brought in a new set of photographs. They were aerial reconnaissance pictures taken by a brave pilot who had flown over Pearl Harbor 3 weeks earlier. The pilot hadn't returned, but his film had, dropped in a canister before his plane ran out of fuel and crashed into the sea. Ushijima looked at the photos under a magnifying glass. They showed dry docks, not 1 or 2, but 20, 30, all of them full, ships in various stages of repair. A carrier with its flight deck peeled back like a tin can, being rebuilt. A battleship with a massive hole in its side, new steel plates already welded on. Destroyers lined up like patients in a hospital, each one moving through the repair process. There were ships in these photos that had been reported sunk at Leyte Gulf, at Saipan, at Iwo Jima. They weren't just being patched, they were being improved. He could see new gun mounts on some, new radar arrays. They were coming back better than before. Cho pointed to one photo. This is what we believe is the West Virginia. It was at the bottom of Pearl Harbor in 1941. Now it's at Okinawa, firing on our positions. Ushijima leaned back. His chair creaked. How many workers do you think are in those shipyards? Intelligence estimates put it at over 100,000, just at Pearl Harbor. There are other yards, Bremerton, San Francisco, San Diego. 100,000. That was more men than Ushijima had on the entire island of Okinawa. And those workers never had to fire a rifle. They just had to weld, to rivet, to bolt steel to steel. He thought about his own country. The shipyards at Kure and Sasebo were silent. The steel mills had no coal. The foundries had no scrap. The men who could have built ships were already in uniform, already fighting, already dying. The Americans had taken their damaged ships and turned them into a school that taught a simple lesson. We can break you faster than you can build yourself, and we can fix ourselves faster than you can break us. Ushijima looked at the photo of the West Virginia. He had been a young officer when that ship was built in 1920. He had read about its launch in naval journals. Now, 25 years later, it was here. It had traveled across time and death to reach this island. It wasn't a ship anymore. It was a message. The message said, "We never left." At 3:15 p.m. on April 2nd, soldiers in a cave a mile from the beach heard the Laffey's guns again.
The sound came through the tunnel entrance like a drumbeat. 5-inch shells fired every 6 seconds, walking up the hillside where Japanese machine gun nests were hidden. Inside the cave, Captain Tanaka sat on an ammunition crate. His men were around him, 20 soldiers, most of them from the same village in Hokkaido. They had trained together, sailed together, survived together. They were his responsibility. One of them, a corporal named Ito, was saying something. Tanaka forced himself to listen. "And I saw it myself, sir, the rising sun flag on the tail. My friend Yoshida, he hit the bridge, direct hit. The ship was burning from bow to stern. We all saw it." The other soldiers nodded. They had heard this story before. They had celebrated it. Yoshida had been a hero, a kamikaze pilot who had sunk an American destroyer at the cost of his own life. The story had been told in the barracks, in the mess halls, and letters home to Yoshida's family. Now the Laffey was outside firing on them. Tanaka looked at Ito. The corporal was waiting for him to agree, to say, yes, your friend died a hero. He sank that ship. But Tanaka had seen the morning reports. He had seen the ship identification photos. He had seen the hull number. Yoshida hit a destroyer, Tanaka said carefully. He did his duty. But that ship is the Laffey, hull number 724. It was damaged, yes, badly damaged, but it wasn't sunk. The cave got quiet. Someone shifted on the ground. A rifle leaned against the wall, fell over with a clatter. Ito's friend died, Tanaka said. He flew his plane into an American warship. He gave his life. That is true. He looked at the faces around him. Young faces, tired faces, faces that had believed in victory 6 months ago. But the Americans, They have shipyards. They have cranes. They have men who can take a ship that has been hit by a plane or a torpedo or a bomb, and they can fix it. They can cut out the damaged steel and weld in new plates. They can replace the guns. They can patch the hull. And they can do it in weeks. Ito is shaking his head. Weeks, sir? It took us 2 years to build a destroyer. 2 years. I know. Then because they are different, Tanaka said. Because their factories did not get bombed, because they have steel, because they have oil, because they have more of everything than we have of anything. He had never spoken like this to his men before. His job was to maintain morale, to keep them fighting, to give them hope. But looking at Ito's face, at the confusion and anger there, Tanaka realized that hope built on lies was not hope at all. It was just a delay. So Yoshida died for nothing, Ito said. It wasn't a question. Tanaka stood up. He walked to the cave entrance and looked out through the camouflage netting. He could see the Laffey, still firing. He could see its hull number. He could see it turning, its guns lifting, firing again. No, he said. Yoshida died trying to protect his country. That is never nothing. But if the ship is still here, the ship is here. But the crew that was on it when Yoshida hit it, some of them are not. Some of them died. Some were burned. Some were blown overboard. We hurt them. We always hurt them. We just can't hurt them enough. He turned back to his men. They were watching him. They needed him to tell them what to do, how to feel, how to make sense of this. The Americans have a machine that fixes ships, a machine that makes new planes, a machine that trains new pilots. We don't have a machine. We have men. We have you. He picked up his own rifle. It was old, a Type 38 from the last war. The wood was worn smooth where his hands had held it for years. So we fight them with what we have. We fight them here, in these caves. We make them pay for every meter. We make them spend their machine on this island. And maybe if we make it costly enough, their machine will slow down. He didn't believe it, but he saw some of the men nod. They needed to believe it. Ito looked away, but his shoulders straightened. Tanaka walked to the back of the cave, where a radio operator sat with a field set. The operator looked up. Message from headquarters, sir. General Ushijima's command. Tanaka took the paper. It was short. It said the Americans were landing on the western beaches now, too. It said they had brought more ships. It said the combined fleet would not be coming. He crumpled the paper and threw it into a corner. It landed near a ration tin, a boot with no laces, a folded photograph of someone's wife. The operator looked at him. Sir? Tanaka picked up his helmet. Tell the men we're moving to the secondary position. We'll set up mortars there. Yes, sir. Tanaka walked back to the cave entrance. The Laffey was still firing. He watched it for a moment, thinking about Yoshida, thinking about all the pilots, all the submariners, all the gunners who had hit these ships, who had watched them burn, who had died believing they had taken an enemy ship with them. They hadn't been wrong. They had hit them. They had hurt them. They had damaged them. But damage, Tanaka was starting to understand, was not the same thing as death. Not for these ships. Not for this Navy. The Laffey fired again. The shell hit somewhere up the hill, close enough to make the ground jump. Dirt fell from the cave roof. The men inside coughed. Tanaka put on his helmet.
He checked his rifle. He thought about his own family, his wife and daughter and Sapporo. He wondered if they were safe. He wondered if they knew what was happening here. He wondered if they understood that the Americans were building something that could not be stopped, that the harder Japan fought, the more the machine would produce. Probably not. It was better that way. Move out, he said to his men. They gathered their gear. They picked up their rifles. They filed out of the cave, staying low, moving into the connecting tunnels that ran like veins through the island. Tanaka was the last one out. He took one more look at the Laffey, watched it fire one more time. Then he turned and followed his men into the dark. The report reached Tokyo at 6:45 p.m. on April 2nd. It landed on the desk of Admiral Toyoda, Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet. He was reading it under a single lamp in a room with blackout curtains. Outside, the city was dark, the buildings sandbagged against the American bombers that came almost every night now. The report was from Okinawa. It had been coded, transmitted, decoded, and typed. It was 10 pages long. Toyoda read it twice. The first time, he read the numbers. The fleet size, the ship types, the landing force estimates. The second time, he read only one paragraph. It was near the end, a short section that the Okinawa command had added almost as an afterthought. It said, "Observed vessels include USS West Virginia, USS California, USS Maryland, USS Pennsylvania. All 4 were reported sunk at Pearl Harbor. Also present, USS Bunker Hill, USS Franklin, USS Enterprise. All 3 were reported sunk or crippled in previous engagements. It appears American repair capabilities have rendered many of our reported naval victories temporary." Toyoda put the report down. He walked to a cabinet and pulled out a file. It was thick, bound with string. The cover said, "Naval Losses, Enemy, 1941-1945. He opened it. Page after page of ship names. Carriers, battleships, cruisers, destroyers. Each name had a date next to it. The date it had been reported sunk. There were check marks next to some. Newer dates. Dates when the same ship had been reported again. He had seen this file before. He had ignored it. It was easier to believe the pilots, to trust the reports, to count the victories. But now Okinawa was telling him something he couldn't ignore. They were seeing these ships with their own eyes. They were being fired on by ships that should have been at the bottom of the ocean. Toyoda picked up his telephone. He dialed a number. It rang 3 times before a voice answered. "Naval Intelligence. This is Toyoda. I need everything we have on American ship repair facilities. Pearl Harbor, San Diego, Bremerton, everything." There was a pause. "Sir, those files are incomplete. Send what you have." He hung up. He sat in his dark office and thought about the last time he had seen the American fleet. It had been at the Battle of Leyte Gulf 6 months ago. They had fought hard. They had sunk ships. They had killed men. He had been on a cruiser watching through binoculars as American carriers burned. One of those carriers had been the Franklin. He had watched it take 2 bombs. He had watched the smoke billow up, black and thick. He had written in his log that it was a confirmed kill. The report on his desk said the Franklin was off Okinawa, launching planes. Toyoda stood up. He walked to a map of the Pacific that covered one wall. It was a big map, showing the entire ocean from California to Tokyo. He had pins on that map, too. Red pins for Japanese ships, blue pins for American ships that had been reported sunk. He started pulling the blue pins. Not all of them, just the ones from the last year. One by one, they came out of the map. There were so many that when he finished, his hand was sore. The map looked different, less cluttered, more honest. His aide knocked and entered. He was carrying a folder. He placed it on Toyoda's desk and stepped back. "American ship repair reports, sir. From our attaché in Switzerland. He obtained them through neutral channels." Toyoda opened the folder. Inside were photographs, copies of American newspaper articles, technical diagrams. One photograph showed the Pearl Harbor dry docks from the air. There were 6 carriers in the photo. 6. 3 of them had notes next to them in Japanese. Reported sunk June 14th, 1944. Reported sunk October 15th, 1944. Reported sunk February 19th, 1945. All in the same dock, all being repaired. Another photograph showed a shipyard on the west coast. It was a long, curved bay full of ships. Not warships, but cargo vessels, transports, tankers. Hundreds of them. The caption said this was just one of 6 such shipyards on the American west coast. Toyoda looked at the numbers. The United States was producing 1 new ship every day. Not small ships, big ones. Liberty ships, they called them. Cargo vessels that could carry 10,000 tons of supplies, and they were building them faster than Japan could build torpedoes to sink them. He turned a page. There was a diagram of a carrier repair. It showed the timeline. The carrier had been hit by a torpedo on June 19, 1944. It had been back in service on August 28th, 10 weeks. 10 weeks to repair a torpedo hole that had flooded 3 compartments and killed 70 men. Toyoda closed the folder. He looked at his map. He looked at the empty spaces where the blue pins had been. The telephone rang. He answered. It was the Minister of the Navy, Admiral Yonai. "Toyoda, the Emperor has asked for a briefing on Okinawa. He wants to know if the American fleet is as large as reported." Toyoda looked at the report from Okinawa.
He looked at the folder of repair photos. He thought about the Emperor, a man who had been told for years that Japan was winning at sea, that American ships were being sunk by the dozen. "Tell His Majesty," Toyoda said, "that the fleet at Okinawa is larger than we expected, and the reports of ships we believe sunk? They're accurate." There was silence on the line. Then Yonai said, "The Emperor will want to know how this is possible." Toyoda picked up one of the photos. It showed a battleship in dry dock. The ship's name was visible on the stern, USS Nevada. The photo had been taken 3 weeks ago. The Nevada had been reported sunk at Pearl Harbor in 1941. It had been raised, repaired, and modernized. It was now at Okinawa.
Tell him, Toyoda said, that the Americans have learned to raise the dead. He hung up. He sat in his dark office and listened to the sound of distant anti-aircraft guns. The American bombers were coming like they came every night. Soon the sirens would start. Soon the city would shake. Toyoda thought about the men at Okinawa, the soldiers in the caves, the pilots waiting for their final flights, the officers watching ships that shouldn't exist. He thought about the American sailors on those ships, the welders in Pearl Harbor, the riveters in San Diego, the crane operators in Bremerton. They were all part of the same machine, a machine that didn't just build ships, a machine that brought them back from the dead. And that machine was now 90 miles from Japan's home islands. At dawn on April 6th, the older officer crouched in a tunnel that smelled of salt water and mold. His uniform was torn at the shoulder. Blood had dried on his left hand from a fragment that had caught him 2 days ago. He could still move his fingers, so he hadn't bothered to bandage it properly. The tunnel entrance looked out over a valley where the Americans were building an airstrip. They had landed bulldozers. Bulldozers! On a beach that had been a battlefield 48 hours ago. The officer watched the machines push dirt, level ground, roll over the spots where Japanese soldiers had died. It was like they were erasing them. Someone crawled up beside him. It was the young officer from the ridge, the one with shaking hands. His helmet was gone. His face was blackened with powder burns. "Sir, the Laffey is still out there." The older officer nodded. He had seen it this morning, a gray shadow against the sunrise, still firing. "And the West Virginia," the young man continued. "And something new, a carrier. The Essex." The Essex had been reported sunk 3 times. Each time it came back with more planes. The young officer looked at him. "Sir, do you think they can repair people too?" The older man turned. "What?" "They're sailors, the ones we kill. Do you think they have a machine that makes new ones?" The question hung in the damp air. Outside, a bulldozer revved its engine. The officer thought about the American mothers in places called Ohio and Iowa and Pennsylvania. He thought about the telegrams they must receive, the ones that started, "We regret to inform you." He thought about the coffins that must arrive in small towns, the folded flags, the taps played on a bugle. "No," he said, "no machine for that." "Then why do they keep coming?" The officer watched the bulldozer push a pile of earth that might have been a bunker. He thought about factories that worked through the night, about shipyards where men in coveralls worked 12-hour shifts, about welders who had never seen the ocean, repairing holes made by bombs they would never hear explode. "He come because they can," he said. The young officer looked like he wanted to say more, but an American shell hit somewhere close and dirt showered down on them, and they both covered their heads. When the dust settled, the younger man was gone. Crawled back down the tunnel to wherever his unit was now. The older officer stayed. He watched the bulldozers. He watched the ships on the horizon. Still there. Still waiting. He thought about how many times they had hit the West Virginia, how many torpedoes, how many bombs, how many men had died trying to sink it, how many families in Japan had celebrated when they heard it was gone. He thought about the letter he would never write, the one that would say, "We did our best, but their ships returned from the dead. Not as ghosts, but as steel. The Navy you fought against at Pearl Harbor is the same Navy at Okinawa. The same ships. The same names. They fixed them. They brought them back from the dead. And that machine was now 90 miles from Japan's home islands." The bulldozer moved again. The officer watched it roll over a spot where he had placed a machine gun nest 3 days ago. The gun was gone now. The men were gone. The bulldozer just rolled over the crater and kept moving, smoothing everything flat. The officer stood up. His leg hurt. His hand hurt. Everything hurt. He walked deeper into the tunnel, away from the light, away from the ships, away from the machines that fix things. In the dark, he could still hear the Laffey firing. He could still see the West Virginia on the ridge that first morning. He could still feel the weight of all that steel, all those ships, all that impossible American persistence. He understood now what Yamamoto had tried to tell them. The Americans wouldn't just outbuild Japan. They would outlast it. They would absorb the damage and fix it. They would lose men and replace them. They would sink ships and raise them. They would do it all with the calm efficiency of a machine that did not know how to stop.
The officer found a dry spot against the tunnel wall. He sat down, he closed his eyes. The shelling started again, the deep booming of battleship guns, the sound that had become the background noise of his life. He didn't need to see the ships anymore. He knew they were there. He knew they would always be there. The ghost fleet, the ships that wouldn't die, the machine that built them, repaired them, sent them back out again and again until the enemy simply ran out of ways to hurt them. He thought about the private in the observation post, asking how they could win. He thought about the young pilot in the cave, asking what the point was. He thought about General Ushijima pulling pins from a map, trying to make the truth match the numbers. They had all reached the same conclusion. They just hadn't said it out loud. The Americans had brought more than a fleet to Okinawa. They had brought a lesson. You cannot defeat an enemy that does not accept death. Not the death of its ships, not the death of its men, not the death of its will. The officer rested his head against the cool stone. The shelling continued. The bulldozers worked, the ships waited. Tomorrow, more Americans would land, more ships would arrive, more planes would fly. In somewhere across the ocean, in shipyards that never slept, new steel was being cut. New hulls were being laid. New guns were being mounted. The machine didn't stop. It would never stop. The officer's hand hurt. He looked at it. The blood had dried brown. He flexed his fingers. He could still move them. For now.